Ruth Jerry's sharp gasp shattered the stifling quiet of the Rowland estate, cutting like a blade through the darkness. The nursery door crashed open, and her heart seized in terror. 1-year-old Frank Rowland lay crumpled on the icy hardwood floor, blood trickling from his tiny head, pooling crimson beneath him, glinting faintly in the ghostly moonlight slipping through the curtains. The crib rail stood rigid, latched tight, a cruel illusion of security that mocked her dread. He must have clambered out, fleeing neglect in a silent act of desperation. Frank lay unconscious, his fragile chest barely stirring. Ruth dropped to her knees, her shaking hands scrambling for her phone as panic gripped her like a vice, her breath ragged with fear. 911 please. It's a baby. He's not breathing. He's bleeding from the head. Hurry please. Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her face, hot and relentless, as she cradled Frank's fragile body, his warmth fading against her. You're okay, little one. You're okay. Help's coming, she whispered, her words a desperate prayer against the suffocating dread. But the room wasn't just heavy with fear and blood. It reeked of heroin, a sickly, chemical stench that stung her nostrils. Ruth's eyes snapped to the bed across the room. Elizabeth Rowland, Frank's mother, lay twisted in sweat-soaked sheets, motionless, her lips parted in a ghostly half-sigh, her arm dangling limp, a needle glinting within reach like a silent accusation. Her shallow breaths were the only sign of life. Ruth's sobs morphed into a burning fury, a wildfire in her chest. This was the 5th time in 3 weeks she'd found Elizabeth lost in a drugged haze, but never like this, never with Frank's life bleeding out on the floor. Ruth had been at the Rowland estate for only 6 weeks, a maid hired to clean and stay invisible, yet the shadows of this house whispered of deeper rot. As sirens screamed closer, slicing through the night, she clutched Frank tighter, rocking him, her tears falling onto his pale cheeks. Hold on, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice trembling with resolve. You're not alone now. The hallway erupted into chaos, a storm of footsteps and shouted commands. Paramedics burst through the front door as Ruth staggered to the staircase, Frank limp in her arms, his forehead wrapped in a towel now soaked a sickening red. A paramedic in navy scrubs, her face etched with urgency, gently pried the child from Ruth's grip and laid him on a gurney, while another checked his vitals with swift precision. Head trauma, pulse weak but there, pupils responsive, the paramedic muttered, her voice clipped yet heavy with the weight of the moment. Ruth's voice shattered as she forced the words out. He fell off the bed. His mother, she's unresponsive. I think she overdosed. The teams split like lightning, one racing Frank to the ambulance, the other charging upstairs with a Narcan kit, their boots echoing like war drums. Ruth stood frozen in the grand foyer, her apron drenched in blood, her hands shaking as if they'd never still. She'd taken this job to pay for college, clean, cook, stay out of the way, but nothing in her brief training at the Rowland estate had braced her for this nightmare. A sharp voice sliced through her daze, cold and cutting. What the hell is happening? It was Vivian, the estate manager and Elizabeth's personal assistant, her sleek figure descending the staircase, heels clicking like gunfire. Always dressed like she owned the marble halls, her eyes burned with accusation. Where's Elizabeth? Where's Frank? Ruth's voice was steady despite her trembling core. Elizabeth overdosed. Frank's on his way to the hospital. Vivian's face twisted, not with shock but with a calculating menace. Does Mr. Rowland know? She hissed, her words dripping with warning. Ruth blinked, her stomach knotting. He's not back from Geneva. I didn't call him. I called 911. Vivian's lips thinned to a razor's edge. He'll want this contained. You shouldn't have involved the police. Her tone was a veiled threat, but Ruth stood firm. She had called because a child's life hung in the balance, and no one else would. On June 12, 2024, Ruth sat in the sterile waiting room of St. Bridget Memorial Hospital, her apron still damp with Frank's blood, her phone clutched like a lifeline in her trembling hands. Her reflection in the glass doors was unrecognizable. Disheveled hair, blood staining her collar, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion and fear. The emergency team had whisked Frank into a trauma room, and the last update said he was stable but under watch for a concussion and possible skull fracture. Ruth had signed the intake forms, her hand shaking as she did so, because Elizabeth remained unconscious on arrival. Across the room, Vivian paced like a caged panther, her heels clicking with predatory rhythm. "You've made this worse," she snapped, her voice low but venomous. "Mr. Rowland despises outsiders meddling in family affairs." Ruth's eyes flashed as she looked up, defiance cutting through her grief. A baby was bleeding from the head. "You think he won't care?" Vivian's lips curled. "He'll care that it was discreet. No photos leaked, no nurses whispering to the press. You don't grasp the power he wields." Ruth rose, her voice steady but laced with fury. "No, you don't grasp what kind of mother she is." Vivian sneered. "Elizabeth's under pressure. You think you know her? 6 weeks here?" Ruth's words were a quiet blade. "I know she left Frank bleeding on the floor with a needle in her arm." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as Vivian's face paled. Ruth's phone buzzed, jarring her nerves, an unknown number. She answered, her voice hesitant. A deep, commanding voice cut through. "This is Max Rowland. I just landed. What's happened to my son?" Ruth's throat tightened, her heart pounding. "Mr. Rowland, you need to come home now." A black town car screeched to a halt outside St. Bridget Memorial Hospital on June 12, 2024. Max Rowland emerged, his suit crisp despite a grueling 12-hour flight, but his face was a storm of anguish and control fraying at the edges. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that had sealed billion-dollar deals, he was a man built for command, yet now he seemed unmoored. "Where's my son?" he barked, shoving through the doors, his voice echoing in the sterile hall. A nurse, her face taut with empathy, directed him to the pediatric ICU. Ruth stood in the hallway, staring through the glass at Frank, asleep under soft monitors, a tiny bandage on his head, his small form fragile yet fighting. Max approached, his breath sharp, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're the maid." She nodded, her voice steady despite the weight of his gaze. "Yes, Ruth Jerry." He looked past her to Frank, and his composed facade shattered, pain carving lines into his face. "They said he hit his head, bleeding, and his mother." His voice broke, unable to finish. Ruth spoke softly, her words heavy with truth. "Sir, I found Frank on the floor, bleeding. He must have climbed out of bed." Elizabeth was unconscious, heroin beside her. "I called 911. Max's eyes snapped back to her, searching, as if seeking a lie but finding none. "Why you?" His voice was raw, almost accusing. "Because no one else did," Ruth replied, her tone unwavering. Max's jaw clenched, his silence thick with unspoken guilt. Then, softly, almost broken, "Thank you for saving my son." Before Ruth could respond, a nurse stepped out, her voice gentle but urgent. "Mr. Rowland, he's stable. He'll recover, but it was close, 45 minutes more without help." She trailed off, the weight of the near loss hanging between them. Max's eyes glistened, not with tears but with a storm of rage, guilt, and dawning realization. He looked at Ruth again. She was no longer just a maid, but the lifeline to his son's survival. Elizabeth woke in a hospital bed on June 12, 2024, N4 dripping into her arm, an officer looming like a sentinel at the door. Her hair was a tangled wreck, last night's makeup smeared into dark hollows under her eyes, a portrait of ruin. She groaned, disoriented, until Max entered, flanked by 2 nurses and a social worker, his presence chilling the room. "Max," she whispered, her voice frail and desperate. "What happened?" He didn't shout, and that made it worse. His voice was ice, cutting deeper than any yell. "You overdosed, Elizabeth." She blinked, confusion clouding her face. "I don't remember." He cut her off, his words sharp as a blade. "Frank's in ICU." He hit his head. Blood everywhere. Elizabeth's lip trembled, her eyes wide with panic. "I didn't mean—" "No, you never do," Max snapped, his voice now a low growl of betrayal. "You left our baby alone in that room while you poisoned yourself. He could have died." The social worker stepped forward, her tone measured but firm. "Mr. Rowland, Child Protective Services has opened a case. Temporary custody decisions will follow the investigation. Elizabeth's voice turned shrill, a desperate wail. You're taking my baby? Max's eyes were steel. You gave him up when you chose a needle over his safety. Elizabeth's sobs echoed, but Max didn't flinch. He turned and walked out, his heart a battlefield of fury and resolve. In the hallway, Ruth waited, her voice low but steady. She'll say I made it up. Max's response was immediate, his tone unyielding. She won't get the chance. He faced her fully, his gaze intense. Stay with Frank until I sort this out. You're the only one I trust in that house. His words carried a weight that settled deep in Ruth's chest. He meant it. On June 15, 2024, the Rowland estate was a tomb of silence, its opulent halls heavy with unspoken truths. Elizabeth had been discharged but barred from returning home, a temporary exile. Frank was healing, sleeping longer, eating again, though the purple bruises on his tiny forehead lingered like ghosts. Max stayed by his side every night at the hospital, his vigil unbroken. Ruth did too, her presence a quiet anchor. Back at the house, Max poured coffee into a plain mug, standing at the kitchen island in a silence that felt like a held breath. Ruth had returned to fetch Frank's favorite blanket and toy elephant, their soft familiarity a small comfort. She hesitated at the doorway, her heart heavy. Come in, Max said, his voice softer now, almost human. She stepped inside, unsure of her place in this fractured world. I checked the security footage, Max said quietly, his eyes distant. You were truthful. You didn't hesitate, you ran straight in. Ruth nodded, her throat tight. I didn't think. I heard his cry, and something in me couldn't ignore it. He stared at her, his gaze piercing. You know what I hate? His voice trembled with self-loathing. I had no clue. My wife, my son's mother, spiraling into oblivion, and I was blind. I thought the nannies were exaggerating, that Elizabeth was just stressed. Ruth looked down, her voice soft but unflinching. You wanted to believe the best in her. Yeah, he whispered, and I missed the truth. A heavy pause hung between them. What did you see that I didn't? Ruth met his gaze, her eyes steady. I saw someone too numb to feel anything, not even a baby's cry. Max ran a hand over his face, the weight of his failure etching deeper lines into his features. You saved my son, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. I'll never forget that. Ruth said nothing, her silence a louder testament than words. Not everyone welcomed Ruth's rising presence. Vivian stood by the marble stairway, arms crossed, her eyes sharp as daggers as she watched Ruth carry Frank's blanket to the nursery. Her lips pursed, venom simmering. Getting cozy, she said, her voice a low hiss. Ruth stopped, her spine stiffening. Excuse me? You're not just folding laundry now, Vivian sneered. You're talking to Max like you're his equal, like you belong in this world. Ruth didn't flinch, her voice calm but ironclad. I'm doing what needs doing. No, Vivian said, her tone icy. You're doing what gets noticed. Max's voice cut through like a thunderclap. Is there a problem? Both women turned. He stood behind them, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, his presence a storm about to break. Vivian straightened, her composure faltering. No problem, sir. Just reminding Ruth of her role. Max stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. Ruth's role is protecting my son, something no one else here has done. Vivian's face twitched. She's a maid. She's why Frank's alive. Vivian swallowed hard, her confidence crumbling. I want you to step back from operations for a few weeks, Max said, his tone final. You've been in charge while I was gone, but things clearly slipped. Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but his glare silenced her, her retreat a shadow slinking away. Ruth stood frozen, the weight of this unasked for power settling on her shoulders, unearned in some eyes, but undeniable. That evening, June 15, 2024, Frank returned home, his small body clinging to Ruth as he saw her, a flicker of trust in his wide eyes. Max watched, his gaze narrowing with unspoken thoughts, the air thick with a shift that went beyond roles. Rain pattered against the nursery windows, a soft, mournful rhythm, as Ruth tucked Frank into his crib, his tiny fingers gripping her pinky with desperate need. The bandage on his head was smaller, his cheeks regaining their rosy hue, but he stirred restlessly, haunted by unseen fears. She kissed his forehead, her touch a silent vow. A voice broke the quiet. I've never seen him calm that fast. Max stood in the doorway, no jacket, no tie, just a man, his shoulders sagging under the weight of fatherhood and failure, his eyes raw with vulnerability. Ruth offered a faint, weary smile. He just needed to feel safe. Max stepped into the room, his gaze lingering on his son. He cries in his sleep sometimes. Did you know? Ruth nodded, her voice soft but heavy. Trauma does that even to babies. They stood in silence, the lullaby mobile spinning slowly overhead, its gentle notes a fragile counterpoint to the tension. Then Max asked, almost to himself, "Why do you care so much?" Ruth looked up, her eyes glistening with old wounds. "Because no one cared enough when I was that small." She paused, her voice trembling with raw truth. "I grew up in foster homes, passed around like a forgotten toy. I was the kid no one chose. So when a child cries, I don't think, I move." Max studied her, his eyes peeling back layers of her guarded heart. "You're more than a maid," he said, his voice low and certain. Ruth shrugged, her defiance quiet. "Titles don't matter to me. People do." He nodded slowly, as if her words reshaped his world. That night, June 15, 2024, Ruth found a note on her bed in her quarters, the paper crisp but heavy with meaning. "Stay as long as you want. The room across from Frank is yours." On June 22, 2024, the Rowland Estates gates creaked open under a gray sky, and Elizabeth stepped from a town car, her appearance a calculated facade, hair styled, makeup pristine, a silk scarf concealing the bruise on her neck. She looked less like a recovering addict and more like a star poised for a spotlight. Max stood on the steps, arms crossed, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "You're not supposed to be here until the custody review," he said, his voice low but sharp. "I'm his mother," Elizabeth snapped, her tone defiant yet brittle. "I have every right to see my son." Ruth, carrying Frank out for fresh air, froze on the garden path, the toddler's small body tensing at Elizabeth's voice. He began to cry, a sharp, fearful wail that pierced the air. Elizabeth stepped forward, her movements jerky, desperate. "He's scared because he doesn't know me. You've turned him against me." Ruth's voice was calm but unyielding, cutting through the tension. "I didn't have to. He remembers." Elizabeth whirled to Max, her eyes blazing. "This is insane. You're letting the maid act like she owns this place, like she's his mother now." Max's voice remained steady, but it carried a lethal edge. "She's not his mother, but she's everything a mother should be." Elizabeth's bitter laugh echoed through the garden. "What? You're falling for her now?" Silence fell, heavy and electric. Max looked away, not in shame but in a painful truth that hung between them. "I can't live a lie anymore," he said, his voice raw. "Frank deserves better. So do I." Elizabeth's face cracked, fear overtaking her defiance. "I want full custody," Max continued, his words a gavel. "I have the lawyers, the files, and Ruth's testimony." Elizabeth's glare locked on Ruth, venomous. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but her words rang hollow, powerless. On July 6, 2024, the courtroom was a silent arena, the air thick with anticipation as the judge delivered the verdict. Sole custody to Max Rowland, supervised visitation only for Elizabeth Rowland. Outside, reporters swarmed like vultures, but Max strode past, his face a fortress, one hand clasping Frank's tiny one, the other resting lightly on Ruth's back as they slipped into the car. At home, the Rowland estate no longer felt like a cold monument. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, but something deeper had shifted, a warmth breaking through the cracks. Ruth now lived in the West Wing, no longer a servant but family, a title she hadn't sought but Max bestowed. "She saved my son," he told his board, his voice firm with conviction. "And something in me too." On a warm April afternoon, April 18, 2024, Ruth sat under the magnolia tree, its blossoms fragrant and soft, Frank asleep in her lap, his breathing steady but fragile. Max knelt beside them, a small velvet box in his hand, his eyes raw with hope and vulnerability. She looked at him, stunned, her breath catching. He spoke little, just one sentence, heavy with truth. "You saved us. Let me spend my life repaying that." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, not from pain or fear, but from being truly seen, her heart laid bare. Once a maid accused of overstepping, now a mother, a partner, a protector, her life rewritten by courage. If this story gripped your heart, give it a like to honor every woman who's shielded a child not her own. Love doesn't ask permission. It acts, fierce and unyielding. Share this with someone who believes in second chances and tell us what you'd have done in Ruth's place. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been judged for your background? I read every single comment. Until next time, remember you are worth more than anyone's opinion of you.